Welcome to the Process Literacy webinar. In this webinar, we'll be working to define your process. If you can't describe work as a process, you can't improve it. Edward Deming. Edward Deming was one of the founding fathers of quality improvement methodology, and this really helps inform the frame of mind that we need to take as we work to analyze a specific process that we would like to improve. The purpose of today's webinar is fourfold. We're looking to discuss process and flow map concepts, to describe the process and office flow mapping strategies, and there are several methods that we can go about doing so, to come together and define your team's roles and responsibilities with respect to this improvement effort. We really want to align them with the collaborative and perhaps your practice-specific aim so that they support measurement and evaluation from the start and work to have sustainability in our mind at the beginning and not just think of it as something we work on at the end. We'll conclude this by identifying areas for improvement and using our office flow map at our deployment swim lane diagram to work on specific change opportunities and opportunities for evaluation and measurement. So processes were developed for a reason, and they could be to make things more efficient. If patients provided feedback on what they were experiencing, it could be out of convenience. And potentially if you're within a large institution or organization, their compliance and rules and regulations that they've put forth that you need to adhere to. And given the intricate nature of healthcare, it's really hard for everyone to fully grasp and experience and understand a particular process from all different perspectives and vantage points. So we want to prevent process illiteracy, which is the lack of familiarity with what actually happens day to day, especially from a patient's point of view, and process arrogance. And that's when we feel we have an exaggerated or over acknowledged sense of knowing how things work. And process arrogancy really just develops over time after we get used to routines and stuck in our ways of doing things. So we really want to prevent becoming illiterate and arrogant in how we go about a process. We're going to work on some process analysis, and this is to really help us come together and provide a common picture, a shared model for you and the core quality improvement team that you've identified and will work with throughout this collaborative. It's to understand the organization's culture and context, and culture being a pattern of learned, group-related perceptions. They can be verbal and nonverbal that are added to the values, the belief system, and potentially the disbelief system of those that you're working with. Culture can also be a set of forces that determine the individual and collective behavior and ultimately the performance. And it's a stable part of the organization that you're within. We further then need to understand the context of which our process is embedded in, and these are the circumstances of a particular event or a situation and how they can occur, and it really complements the culture. We can see culture and context as being woven together. As we're walking through the process, we really want to promote ownership of this process, not only by those that are in the core quality improvement team, but those that eventually will take on this process as part of day-to-day work. So it really helps to identify which parts of the system are important to measure, and in order to understand and improve the care system, to identify and prioritize those components that we'll be targeting. And this is where having systems to measure and understand improvement will be particularly important. This process analysis also helps us to generate hypotheses for why we're making a change. We have a common model that helps generate more potential approaches to improving the system, but then also to go about identifying redundancy, waste, places that we could reorganize, and utilize some of those other change concepts. So there are 5 main things that we're really working on evaluating when we analyze a particular process. There are several mechanisms by which we can go about outlining a process and identifying those things that impact it. One that you might be familiar with are cause and effect diagrams or fishbone diagrams. Here at the center is the backbone that leads to maybe the problem or the area that we're really trying to improve. And there are 6 items that can impact that problem or the change that we want to make. They can be the environment, people, equipment, management, materials, and processes. And along each of those 6 items, there's the potential to have subclauses or items that could further impact the 6 levels. So when working with a cause and effect diagram, we really want to describe a range of factors that influence our outcome or the problem of interest. And starting with the problem to be solved, build out for those people, processes, policy, methods, materials, and environmental factors, and investigate the areas that may contribute to this problem. When we go about mapping or modeling a process, there are additional ways that we can do this after we've gone through that cause and effect diagram. The first of which are flowcharts. And these really use standardized symbols with some annotation to denote a patient's path through the system. We have deployment flowcharts, which then use the same symbols as our normal flowchart. It could use swim lanes or columns for each team member and their respective roles, and also has columns for measurement and change opportunities. And the final one is a workflow diagram, and it's really a physical layout of a setting to show the flow of people, materials, and information that flows through the process of interest. So looking at the flow chart, we can see from this picture, it's a nice snapshot of a particular process. We can see detailed steps and the specific items that occur within each of those steps that take us from the start or the beginning of the process until that process is completed. Everything is connected together by a one-directional arrow, and if there happens to be a choice that needs to be made or decision made, all steps ultimately come back and flow into the final end of the process. Flowchart outputs. This is the ultimate snapshot and picture of what your process is. And it'll be a diagram that shows you all the steps or stages of a process that occur sequentially. The level of detail really depends on how you go about using this. Is it a bird's eye overview of a very simple process? Or is it something that you intend to use when training new individuals that come to your practice? Then the level of detail may need to be a little more so that you can properly train them of the respective roles and responsibilities. Symbols represent each step. As we saw in the previous slides, there's a little bit of description that represents each step of the process, and those steps were linked together by symbols or arrows showing the flow and direction of the process. Keeping in mind that we want to have a snapshot of a process, we need to first identify the process that will be mapped and do so in its current state. What item or process requires attention that you want to focus your improvement efforts around, and recruit people who are or will be instrumental to this process not only during the improvement period, but as you're working to sustain this endeavor. It's also important to try and involve leadership at this point so that they know what's happening from the grassroots up and can work to encourage and be a champion for sustainability. Start from the very high-level bird's eye overview and then layer in the degree of detail that's necessary for your process and the steps that you're looking to document. You then have to keep the patient's perspective in mind since they're the ones that are going to be going through this process. Next, identify what the first and final steps are, and then fill in all those steps between your input and your output. Having that bigger picture in mind will help as you layer in those items, and having those people around the table to discuss what each of those components are so that we're very literate in what we're trying to accomplish here. Then continually ask yourself and the team of people around you, what's next? Keep doing that until you've exhausted all your options between the input and output. Next, determine points where any decision will be made. And for each decision, list all the potential options. And for every option, it must come back into the main process pathway. Keep doing this until you've reached the last step or the output of your process. Then walk through it. Observe the process. See if anything's been left out or if there's steps or redundancy in there. Don't take them out just yet, but add notes that these are areas of inefficiencies. Those, along with any areas that you have questions about, mark, and those will be potential change opportunities and opportunities to evaluate improvement efforts. Once you've done an initial walkthrough of a rough draft of your flowchart, next go and layer in flowchart symbols. The first and last one, the start, end, input, output, can be represented by an oval. All the steps that are in between that represent actions or processes that are occurring within your flow, note with a rectangle. For any documents that are included in this process, potentially an after-visit summary, use of a tool, use the document symbol, which is the rectangle, and the bottom is a squiggly line. For those decisions that you've included, represent those with a diamond. And if your process is fairly long and does not fit on one page, connector symbols will be necessary. The connector symbols will have a symbol inside of them, maybe an A, an ampersand, a number, any of those items that will note what the first page is and how that connects and corresponds to the next page. And then, of course, as I've mentioned several times, your flow. So you have lines or arrows that indicate not only the sequence of steps, but the direction of the flow. There are also some additional symbols that you can include. The one that I wanted to note here is the cloud, and this can be used to represent something that you're unsure of, had a question on, maybe the person that's instrumental to this step or process is unavailable or not at work that day. Note that step in this item with a cloud so that you can come back to it and begin to test items, do your PDSA cycles, and evaluate your impact of the improvement efforts.
We're now going to look at a process mapping example about how one practice has come together to identify immunization opportunities. Their flow starts when the patient calls to schedule a visit, any type of visit. And during that call, the front desk has a system in place to check the patient's medical record and determine whether or not that adolescent is up to date on their well visit care. If they're not, they have a system to schedule that adolescent for a full well child visit. If they are up to date, they can schedule the visit as fit. If it's a sick or acute or chronic visit that they need to attend, they can put them in that time slot. Regardless of the visit, at the start of each week, the team is going to review the EMR and cross-check that immunization history with what is listed in the Impaxis system. And from there, determine for each of the adolescents that have visits what immunizations are needed for that week. And finding some way of noting the need to schedule a visit if the patient is taking a series or in the middle of a series for a vaccination and scheduling that next dose. So flagging the chart for what needs to happen after this current visit. They're also noting whether there is a series to continue or complete in that same process and making sure that they have some systems in place to order the vaccine, flagging the chart that they need to continue and provide the next dose for that vaccination, and to have the appropriate vaccination information sheet ready. If they don't have a series to continue or complete, they do the visit as appropriate and conduct and provide any other vaccinations that are due. Again, going back to whether or not a series is ready to continue or complete, they need to make a decision about scheduling an immunization-only visit if they do need to complete that series, or just to schedule the next annual well child visit, and then this process is complete. What makes this a little more helpful is to put everyone's roles into silos or columns solely for the purpose of identifying what your individual's task may be through a quick verification visually. So each person can identify themselves from the top label of the column, front desk, nursing or MA staff, and the physician, to know what their role is within the system. And then that's the only way that they're siloed. Everyone then comes together knowing where their role is within this process through quick visual identification. So this just takes the same process map that we saw in the previous slide and breaks it down to what roles fall under the column of the front desk, what we foresee the nursing or MA staff to do, and where the physician comes into play for these items. And you can see, for example, with the front desk, they're the ones that are handling the calls to schedule the visits and verifying if the patient's up to date on their adolescent visit. And again, towards the bottom of the flow diagram, scheduling that next well visit or immunization only visit to complete the patient's experience. Nursing is then responsible for checking the vaccination records and noting what's needed in specific to those series like HPV or MenB. And the physician is the one that's putting the order in place and conducting the visit as needed. What this helps us do is to then take a next step as we've looked at what currently may be in place or what our ideal system is, and identify what some change opportunities may be to move the needle to where we would like to go, and what ways we could potentially measure those changes and have some sort of way to evaluate the impact our changes made. So here, our change opportunities could be, what's the best way to review and report out on a specific adolescent's immunization history? Having gone through and reviewed the EMR and Impaxis, who's going to do that? When should we do that? How frequently should we do it? What do we do about same-day appointments? Thinking about different ways that we can test change around this component. Where to note the needed immunizations and how to review and order those. What if a patient isn't up to date or there are discrepancies? What do we do? How do we convey that to the team or the providers that may see this patient? And then to that next level, communicating a note for the next dose and the visit that may be needed to complete a series and ensure that that visit is scheduled in appropriate timing and spacing. And some ways to potentially measure these things, if we're looking about how to review and report out on immunization history, it may be trialing the best time of day to have a team huddle, trying it at the start of the week or daily, and see what's the best way to communicate that information.
In summary, flowcharts can really help us accomplish a lot of things. First, we want to encourage our team to communicate appropriately and collaborate together on this improvement effort. These flowcharts and process maps, deployment diagrams help us to identify the roles of each team member and foster teamwork so that we can be as efficient as possible. It also helps us to know whose roles are what and what each other's responsibilities are, so we can not only keep each other in check, but work to better communicate with all the players involved. Finally, with all the different players sitting at the table to map out the flowchart or to do the deployment diagram, it gets total team buy-in. Having everyone actively involved in all steps of the process, activities that may impact performance, really helps to shift to a culture where this is a group activity and not a top-down mandated approach in organizational change. It's a collective effort that everyone has a piece and ownership of. We're looking to build this process and flow for sustainability. As mentioned before, we really do think of sustainability as something when everything's said and done, but we want to keep this in mind so that as we're looking at our current state and where we would like to be, we work to design the process to account for human behavior and potential errors that could occur. Also thinking about the organization's culture. We learned from the beginning that not only culture but context really impacts a process and the different ways that it could go about. So framing our current state and how we would like it to be in the future with the values and beliefs in mind, knowing that these will affect the ability to deliver improvements, is a way to get ahead of the game. You also get to empower and engage your staff. Again, they have an active role in noting what the current process looks like, what burdens may be upon them, and brainstorm ways to make this an effective, efficient, and improving outcome for your institution or your practice. You can then use it to strategically target your improvement efforts. You have a good understanding of the current state, you're very literate, and you're not arrogant about what happens. All the players have come to the table, and you know what it truly looks like. This will help you identify areas of waste that could be problematic, duplicative, and really impact your office flow. These are your opportunities for change, your potential interventions and PDSA cycles that you can work on to improve and remove those areas of waste. And then you can use that to determine the order and prioritize your improvement efforts so that you can take off bite-sized pieces to chew and to work on and help build the confidence in everyone that this is a project that's worthwhile, that you can make changes in, and that will have a potential impact.
So your role now as a team is to come together and make a deployment flowchart. You can start by creating a normal process map and then stratifying each individual's roles and responsibilities into their particular columns, or go straight to the deployment flowchart. But really looking at what your current process is around reviewing immunization history for an adolescent, and how your clinic and your providers go about verifying and checking vaccine status for every visit that adolescents are attending. During this process, as you're looking at what you currently do, think about how different staff are involved and their roles at point of care, what happens at different interactions and touch points with the family, things that they may need to complete, items that may help you verify, and factor all those things in there and have everyone that's part of this process come together at the table to define what you're currently doing so you can come up with a game plan during our future action periods as we work to modify our office flow, as we build on test of change in our future section and webinar on PDSA learnings.